We come now to our final set of lectures in our course on famous Romans. Our first lectures, from Publius Cornelius Scipio, the consul of 218, down through the destruction of Carthage by his descendant, Publius Cornelius Scipio, explored the rise of the Roman Empire. We then looked in our lives from Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus through Julius Caesar, at the downfall of the Free Republic and the rise of the empire of the Caesars. Our lectures on Augustus and Virgil provide a bridge to our third set of lectures, our lectures on lives of the famous Romans in the great day of empire, the immense majesty of the Roman Empire of the 1st and 2nd centuries A.D. The empire created by Augustus, his imperial system, is one of the most remarkable achievements of statecraft in all history. It secured for the Roman people and their empire a peace and prosperity unprecedented and without parallel until the 20th century, until our own day. It was an empire that stretched ultimately from Britain all the way out to the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, all the way from the United Kingdom to Iraq. It stretched from the North Sea, from Germany, to the sands of the Sahara. If you were going to take a trip through this empire at its height, you would begin in Britain, pass on across to France, through Belgium and Holland, through Western Germany, into Switzerland and Austria, Hungary, through Romania, into Bulgaria, what was once Yugoslavia, to Greece, to Turkey, to Lebanon and Syria, to Israel and Jordan, on into Egypt, Libya, through Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, up into Spain and Portugal. If you were to take that trip today on your own, you would require a dozen languages, you would require 24 visas, and have to change your currency that many times. But in those days, due to the achievement of Augustus, one language, Latin, would carry you anywhere in that empire, and with Latin and Greek together, there would be no problem whatsoever. One currency, the coinage of Rome, one set of laws. It was a tolerant empire. Beginning with both Caesar and Augustus, the Romans respected the religion and culture of the multicultural, diverse empire over which they ruled. Some of the most outstanding temples in Egypt today, to the gods of Egypt, were erected by Roman emperors. Roman emperors were ceremonially crowned as pharaohs over Egypt. They sponsored local languages like Syriac and Celtic. You could plead a case in court in Celtic or in Syriac. These emperors as well respected the religion of the Jews. And Caesar and Augustus both gave to the Jewish inhabitants of their empire a special status, permitting the Jews alone not to offer up sacrifice to the emperor, but rather to pray to their God, to Yahweh, for the well-being of the emperor. It was an empire in which the ordinary citizen had a set of rights and privileges, including the right to appeal to Caesar. This is portrayed well for us in the book of Acts. Paul cannot be beaten because he is a Roman citizen. And when he appeals to Caesar he must go. So an empire of law, of respect and tolerance, and an empire of social mobility. You could be born a slave in this empire, achieve your freedom, and go on to become a multimillionaire. And this was not an isolated case. It happened again and again. And play a respected role in society. Become a priest of the cult of the emperor. So social mobility. It was an empire with a superb network of roads. We can still drive today over Roman roads and over Roman bridges. It was an empire that was guarded and given peace by a cost-efficient army of 360,000 men along this vast frontier. And to repeat from an earlier lecture, for all of this, you worked 2 days a year to pay your taxes. Such was the achievement of Augustus. It was well administered. It had a superb bureaucracy, which in the heyday was large enough to get the job done, but not so large that it became burdensome. And we read in the letters of Pliny the Younger, the close friend of the Emperor Trajan, the qualities, the superb qualities of these civil servants who devoted themselves to the public life of the Roman Empire. And over the generations, it produced a high quality of leadership at the top. Caesar, Augustus, Trajan, and Hadrian, subjects of our lectures. And it was so well established that even idiosyncratic emperors like Claudius and Nero, Tiberius and Caligula could not take it off its track. But these idiosyncratic emperors do provide some interest for us, and we will devote our next two lectures to Claudius and to Nero. It was important for Augustus to establish a peaceful succession to the imperial power. Unless he clearly designated a successor, he feared that civil war would break out again. And it is in his determination to have a successor from his own line that we most clearly see laid out the monarchical aspects of this empire. It was to be a hereditary monarchy, even as it was in fact a military dictatorship. Augustus put all powers in his hand, and the very title by which we refer to these leaders, emperors, is but the Latin word imperator, which means all-conquering general. So it was a military dictatorship and a monarchy. That was the vision of Caesar and the achievement of Augustus. But Augustus, though he was fortunate in so many things, it would become a proverb to be luckier than Augustus. He was not lucky in his family. He had been married early on to a woman, Scribonia. He divorced her. She nagged him too much. And he fell deeply in love with Livia, from a very high-born Roman family, and she with him. She was already married and in fact expecting. She was 6 months pregnant with her husband's child when Augustus married her. And they remained devoted throughout their lives. But they never had a son themselves. She had sons by earlier marriages, including Tiberius, but they never had a son. And his daughter Julia was a tremendous disappointment to Augustus. It was important for him to revitalize the moral character of the Romans, to make them worthy of their ancestors who had been pious and frugal and chaste. But it turned out that both his daughter and his granddaughter, also named Julia, were nymphomaniacs. And when their crimes were uncovered to him, he sent them into banishment and would not let them come back. He called them my running sores. On one occasion when he was in the amphitheater watching a gladiatorial game, the crowd shouted out, "Bring back the Julias, bring back the Julias." And he turned upon them and said, "If you ever bring up their names to me again, I pray to the gods that you may be cursed with daughters as vicious and lascivious as they are." He had grandsons. He devoted his love and attention to Lucius and Gaius, his grandsons. He also devoted attention to his nephew, the son of his sister Octavia. Like his mother, Marcellus was a fine and upright young man. He died early on. And Lucius and Gaius, still young, were taken from Augustus as well. Some wondered at this coincidence of calamities in his family life and wondered if, in fact, his devoted wife, Livia, was not responsible for some of these early deaths. For she was eager to have her son, Tiberius, follow Augustus. Augustus never liked Tiberius. He did not dispute that he was a capable man. He had been an effective general on the frontiers. He was a good administrator. He was not marked by any particular vices in his youth. Augustus had to be stern with him. Policy demanded it. Tiberius had been much in love with his own wife, and Augustus had taken that wife away from him and forced him to marry his lascivious daughter Julia. Tiberius never overcame this loss. Tiberius was shunned into the background while the grandsons, Lucius and Gaius, were alive, and dishonored by his wife's infidelities, feeling hated by Augustus, he had retired to Rhodes for a number of years, the island of Rhodes. But when the grandsons died, Augustus had him brought back and began to associate him in the imperial power. There was no one left. Augustus's powers came to him by a vote of the Senate and the Roman people. It was all completely legitimate. And in his waning years, he associated Tiberius in this same collection of powers. And when Augustus died on the 19th of August, just around 3 p.m. in 14 A.D., Tiberius assumed the imperial powers without any opposition. But by this time, Tiberius was already advanced in years. His character had hardened under the insults. He had become suspicious, envious, threatened by others. And of all the Roman emperors, perhaps he most recalls Joseph Stalin. Someone was always plotting to get him. He did not enjoy the imperial power, but he used it. And as emperor from 14 to 37 A.D., the empire itself was extremely well governed. The provinces were ruled with care. Any governor who was extortionate in his collection of taxes was brought back to Rome. But many senators felt under Tiberius what they had never felt under Augustus: threats and a reign of terror. And above all, Tiberius used the law of treason, the maiestas, as it was called, which he hardened into a law that made even a comment against the emperor into treason. A man could be put to death just for going into a bathroom with a ring on his hand which had a coin inside of it of the portrait of the emperor. It was thus a convenient and flexible rule to attack any he felt threatened his power. He hated Rome so much that he withdrew to Capri and there spent his remaining years. He had become so dangerous that the rumors were he was smothered to death by a pillow. And his young nephew, Gaius, became emperor in his place. Young, the son of the distinguished general Germanicus, young Gaius had spent much of his early life in camp with his father as a little baby soldier. And that's his nickname, Caligula, from the soldier's boot. Now, he is one of the most idiosyncratic of the emperors, and we see how well established the empire was, that it could survive his 4-year reign. Early on, he began to demonstrate characteristics of a mental aberration. He wanted to name his favorite horse as consul. He was so taken with that horse that he built for the horse an elaborate stall made of marble and had him special purple blankets. He committed incest with his sisters, it was rumored. He instituted a reign of terror and was finally assassinated by his own bodyguard. And such had been the loathing for Caligula that some senators actually dreamt of restoring the free republic. And they were debating in the Senate House after the assassination of Caligula was learned. They were debating how to go about establishing the free republic. But the bodyguard of the emperor struck first. And they were roaming up and down the imperial palace, plundering, when suddenly one of the members of the Praetorian Guard, that 9,000-strong bodyguard created by Augustus, one of them saw these little feet sticking out from behind a curtain. And he pulled back the curtain, and there was Claudius, really the last surviving male descendant of Augustus. And the soldier pulled Claudius out, and said, what are you doing here? Why are you standing behind the curtains? And he said, well, I'm just... He said, I know, what are you trying to say? And poor Claudius did stutter. And the soldier said, listen, you better tell me what you're doing back here. And Claudius just fell upon his knees and grabbed his legs. And the soldier said, you are the son of Drusus, aren't you? Yes, I am. You come with me. And so he was taken, brought before the Praetorian Guard, and hailed out as emperor. And then forced upon a reluctant Senate. And so, 50 years of age, Claudius descended not only from Drusus and from Augustus, but he was also descended from the daughter of Mark Antony and Octavia, the sister of Augustus. So a descendant of Antony would sit upon the imperial throne. He was 50 years of age, and for years had been just kept completely in the background. He had a physical disability that caused him to walk with a shuffle, and he was thought also to be slow in learning. Later on he would explain, and there was good reason to believe him, he wasn't slow at all. That was the only way to stay alive under Tiberius and Gaius, because he was an heir to Augustus, and thus a potential threat to be emperor. He had, in fact, a superb education, and his tutor had been Livy, the historian. He learned the Etruscan language and would write a history of the Etruscans. He wrote a history of Carthage. His Greek was excellent, but he had a manner of speaking and even of writing that was very confused seeming. And we possess letters written by Augustus about Claudius, written by Augustus to Livia. And he writes and says, you know, Claudius amazes me. Sometimes he can carry on a reasonable conversation, and at other times I can't make head or tails of what he's trying to say. What are we to do with him? I fear that he will embarrass us in public, and yet I had lunch with him today, and it was the most pleasant of occasions. After the death of Augustus, Tiberius sent Claudius into an enforced exile. Claudius lived in a nice villa, continued his studies. He also liked to gamble, that is true. And he wrote a very good book, apparently, on how to gamble. And he was very inventive. He developed a table that he could use while riding in a carriage that would keep the dice from falling off. He learned to eat a whole lot, and throughout much of his life he was a glutton. And then, when Tiberius died, Caligula brought Claudius back to the court. And Caligula even invested him with the honor of being a consul. And Claudius was shown a great deal of deference. Members of the equestrian order, the second order in the Commonwealth after the Senate, would rise whenever he came into their presence. He was allowed to make some public speeches, but also he was the butt for Caligula's jokes. And Caligula would give these banquets and tell Claudius it was going to be at, let's say, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Instead, it would start at 3:30. Claudius would come, couldn't find a couch to lie down upon, would have to roam around and around while everybody laughed at him. Sometimes they would pelt him with crust of bread and grapes. Other times they would, he fell asleep after he ate. And when he was asleep, Caligula would put little slippers on his hands and then wham him with a whip. And Claudius would wake up and rub his eyes with these slippers, and they would all laugh at him. But he had the last laugh, because there he was behind that curtain when Caligula had been assassinated. And so he became emperor. And he proved to be an extraordinarily good administrator. Now, in dealing with the emperors, with figures like Caligula and with Claudius, we are faced with a problem in our sources. We do not possess for the Roman Empire the kind of sources you would have to write about a 20th century political leader like President Nixon or President Reagan. If you were writing about a 20th century leader, you would be overwhelmed by the number of sources available to you. all the documentary sources, congressional reports, memoirs by numerous people who knew the leader well. In the ancient world, these sources, some of which did exist, like documentary sources, have largely disappeared. What we have are literary sources, and three stand out for our period of the 1st century A.D. One is the historian Dio Cassius. And Dio Cassius, or Cassius Dio as he is also known, wrote a history in the early 3rd century A.D., which is very full, but written very much from the point of view of a senator. We have the biographies of Suetonius, which are entertaining and even masterful, and we have the history of Tacitus, a most powerful historical thinker. But all of these are highly tendentious, written largely from the point of view of the Senate, which was not always favorably disposed to emperors like Caligula or even Claudius. And we balance this off by some documentary records, by inscriptions, by coins, by papyri preserved in the deserts of Egypt, which sometimes have official documents. And from this, a picture emerges of Claudius as an emperor who was very capable. He carried out a successful foreign as well as domestic policy. His credentials as emperor were somewhat suspect, and the most superb credential you could ever have as an emperor was to be a conquering general. And so Claudius organized an expedition against Britain. Caligula had thought of conquering Britain, but had utterly failed to carry it off. Claudius now invaded Britain, found the right generals for the job, and began the conquest of that island, first undertaken by Julius Caesar. And under Claudius, Britain would be added to the empire. Provinces in Africa and Europe and Asia Minor were also added to the empire, and Claudius became the first emperor since Augustus truly to expand the frontiers of the empire. He also undertook financial reforms, reforms of taxation. He undertook a broad expansion of the citizenship. And Claudius played a fundamental role in transforming the empire into a commonwealth of nations. He expanded the citizenship on a basis broader than any emperor before him, except for Julius Caesar. And we possess a speech which Claudius made when the Senate was reluctant to allow Gauls into the Senate. And Claudius said, "But the very greatness of Rome lies in the fact that from our beginning we have brought people to us from all over the world. We are ourselves immigrants. We came from Troy. My family immigrated to Rome. Romulus opened up the city of Rome to any who wanted to come and have a chance, have opportunity here. The Gauls, yes, we once fought them, but we also once fought wars against the Aequi and the Volsci, against the Samnites. And how many of you in our Senate today are descended from those great people?" So a historically minded speech. We think of a speech that President Roosevelt once gave, in which he addressed his audience as fellow immigrants. And that is what Claudius said. And so the consulship began to expand. And emperors would one day come to sit upon the throne, who were born not only in Italy, but in Spain, Africa, Syria. And Claudius is a fundamental part of this expansion. He took the greatest care for the food supply of Rome. And that, again, was very important. An unending supply of cheap bread was critical to maintaining peace in Rome. And one of the problems was that Rome did not have an adequate harbor. Ostia was the port of Rome, but it silted up, and grain had to be brought all the way up from Naples, an enormous cost. And Claudius built a huge new harbor and port facility at Ostia. So important task. Rome was running out of good supplies of pure water, and he built 2 huge aqueducts, one of which still marches across the countryside outside of Rome. And yet, well, he was a micromanager. He loved the courtroom, and he was always going as judge and would sit there and concentrate on a case, and then his mind would wander a little bit. He would go roaming off and get a sausage and bring it back and eat it. And then having eaten, he would go to sleep. But then he would wake up and would be right on the case again. He would suffer a good deal of abuse from the people in the courtroom, the attorneys and others who were presenting cases. At one point, he was trying this man for sexual offenses. And the man was denying that he had done these things, so Claudius began to bring in prostitutes to testify against him. The man took this as an insult and threw his writing case at Claudius, calling him, "You stupid idiot," cut his face. Claudius just wiped off the blood from his face and allowed the trial to go on. He loved the gladiatorial games. He was just inveterate attendee at these gladiatorial games. Julius Caesar had not liked gladiatorial games and had insulted the people by doing his correspondence while he sat watching the games. But Augustus knew how important these were to the people. And he was an avid watcher of the games. And Claudius followed him in this. You know, the gladiatorial games are perhaps one of those links between us and the 1st and 2nd century A.D. because only these 2 ages in history, our own day and that of the 1st and 2nd century A.D., have made spectator sports into the very essence of a social occasion, in which athletes have become some of the most admired figures in society. And Claudius would go among the gladiators. On one occasion, one gladiator had 3 sons, and they appealed to Claudius in the arena to let their father stop being a gladiator. And Claudius went down among them, hugged them, and said, "See what it is to have good sons." So he took the gladiatorial games very, very seriously, endearing himself to the people. He was also said to be too much devoted to his wives. Much of his ordinary business was conducted for him by freedmen, by former slaves. These were the people he could really trust, not senators. And they tended to wall him off from unpleasant information. And along with his freedmen, he was much under the thumbs of his wife. His first wife was Messalina. She was a high-born Roman aristocrat, and again, like the daughters of Augustus, I don't know how to say it, except that she was a nymphomaniac, and her infidelities were constant, until finally she decided to go through with a marriage to Gaius Silius, who was to be consul of the year. Go through a marriage even though she was already married to Claudius. And so he finally had to have her put to death. And he said, "I will never again have a wife. It is just too painful." And almost immediately, he began to pay court to his niece, Agrippina. And this was technically illegal to marry your niece, but he just loved her so much, and she liked her uncle. At least she liked her uncle being emperor. And so they married. And she already had a child, Nero. And she encouraged Claudius to adopt Nero, to make him his own son. And then, having gotten what she wanted out of Claudius, one evening he was there with her, and she had prepared for him his favorite dish, which were mushrooms. We're now in the year 54 A.D., and she has prepared for Claudius his favorite dish, mushrooms. And he ate really rapidly. You know, the food would dribble out of his mouth and he would burp. In fact, he had a law passed, though people didn't quite see the necessity for making this a law passed that at a public banquet you could break wind. And you should not be thought to be embarrassed by that. And he even specified you could break wind loudly or quietly. Either way was permissible. So there he was eating and breaking wind and gobbling this stuff down, when suddenly he got a tummy ache. Agrippina had poisoned his mushrooms, but he had eaten them so fast that they weren't having the proper effect upon him. And then the story has various means of how she finally dispatched him, but I like best that she dipped a feather into the poison and said, "Here, dear, let me stick this down your mouth because it's obvious that you're having an upset stomach. This will make you vomit." And she squiggled down enough poison that Claudius was carried off. And so, in this semi-comic fashion, Claudius died, and Nero ascended to the throne. And to Nero, we will turn in our next lecture.